When my children started arguing about my will, I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not stop them. I stayed exactly where I was, sitting in the same chair I had sat in for years, the one near the window where the afternoon light always falls softly on the floor. My hands were folded in my lap, one resting on top of the other, the way I used to sit when I waited for their father to come home from work. I could hear my own breathing, slow and careful, and underneath it, the steady thumping of my heart, loud in my ears, like it was trying to remind me that I was still here, that I was still alive, even if no one else in that room seemed to notice. The argument did not begin suddenly. It crept in, slowly, disguised as a conversation. At first, they spoke in polite voices, asking questions that sounded reasonable on the surface, but it did not take long for the politeness to fade. Words became sharper, voices rose, old resentments that had been buried for years began to claw their way back to the surface. I watched their faces change as they spoke, watched familiar expressions twist into something I hardly recognized. These were the same faces I once kissed goodnight. The same mouths that used to call out for me when they were afraid of the dark. Now those mouths were forming sentences about my belongings, my money, my house, as if I were already gone. They were fighting over things that did not belong to them yet. They spoke about my jewelry first, the small gold pieces I rarely wore anymore, each one carrying a memory. The bracelet their father bought me when we had almost nothing but hope. The necklace I wore to my daughter's wedding, my hands shaking as I fastened it around my neck. They spoke about my house next, the walls that had heard every laugh, every argument, every quiet prayer whispered late at night. They talked about my pension, the money their father worked for until his hands grew tired and his back began to ache. They even mentioned the small savings account we built slowly, year by year, sacrificing little comforts so we could feel safe one day. They spoke as if all of it were already theirs, as if I were only a name on a piece of paper waiting to be erased. My eldest son spoke the loudest. He always had. Even as a boy, he liked to be heard, liked to feel important. Now his voice filled the room, firm and demanding, certain that his age and position gave him the right to decide. My daughter cried and shouted at the same time, her words breaking apart as tears streamed down her face. She accused, she defended, she reminded her brothers of all the things she believed she had given up. My youngest son did not sit at all. He paced the room, back and forth, his footsteps heavy against the floor. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched, his body restless, like he was already tired of waiting for something that had not yet happened, like he was tired of waiting for me to die. I watched them all, my children, the people I once held close to my chest, and I felt something heavy settle inside me. Not anger, not hatred, just a deep, tired sadness that wrapped itself around my heart and made it hard to breathe. I wanted to interrupt them. I wanted to tell them to stop, to remind them that I was still sitting right there, that I could hear every word. But my voice would not come. It was as if silence had chosen me, as if it had gently placed its hand over my mouth and whispered that this was something I needed to see, something I needed to understand. All the while, I kept a quiet secret inside my chest. It rested there, steady and calm, untouched by the chaos around me. They did not know that after their father died, I rewrote my will. They did not know how many nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about my life, my choices, and the way everything had changed. They did not know how lonely the house felt after the funeral, how the walls seemed to echo with memories instead of voices. They did not know that in that quiet, I had made a decision that took more courage than anything I had done before. They did not know that none of them were the main heirs anymore as they argued, as their voices overlapped and clashed. I thought about the moment I signed those papers. My hand trembled, not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood the weight of my own worth. I remembered the pen pressing into the paper, the sound it made, soft but final. I remembered feeling something close to peace, like I had finally spoken a truth I had been swallowing for years. Everything they were fighting about, every object and every number they mentioned, had already been promised to someone else. Someone they never expected, someone who had seen me not as an ending, but as a living, breathing person. The argument grew louder. My eldest son leaned forward, his face red with frustration. My daughter wiped her tears angrily, accusing everyone of being selfish. My youngest stopped pacing and slammed his hand against the table, demanding fairness. The room felt smaller with every word, like the walls were slowly moving in. And in the middle of it all, I sat quietly, shrinking into my chair, feeling invisible in a way I had never felt before. It was a strange feeling, to be present and yet absent at the same time. To be the reason for the argument, and not part of it. I looked down at my hands and noticed how old they had become. The skin was thinner now, the veins more visible. These hands had done everything for them. They had cooked, cleaned, worked, comforted, and held. They had wiped tears and soothed fears. They had let go when it was time, even when it hurt. And now, those same hands rested uselessly in my lap while my children spoke about my life as if it were already over. I wondered when it happened, when the love we shared turned into expectation, when concern turned into calculation. As their voices echoed around me, memories began to surface, uninvited and sharp. I remembered holding each of them for the first time, their tiny bodies warm and fragile against mine. I remembered promising myself that I would always protect them, always put them first. I remembered the nights I stayed awake worrying about their future, about how to give them more than what I had. And now, here they were, grown and strong, arguing over what would be left of me when I was gone. Without once asking how I felt about being left behind while still alive, the sadness deepened, but it did not break me. Instead, it settled, heavy and calm, like a truth finally accepted. I realized in that moment that I had already done my crying. I had cried after my husband died. I had cried during long, empty evenings when the phone did not ring. I had cried when I felt forgotten. There were no tears left for this moment, only understanding, only clarity. I lifted my eyes and looked at their faces again, really looked at them. They were not cruel people, not monsters. They were simply people who had forgotten something important. They had forgotten that their mother was still a person with thoughts, feelings, and dreams. They had forgotten that my life was not a prize to be divided, but a story still being written. And as painful as that realization was, it also gave me strength, because the truth was, I was still alive. I was sitting right there, breathing the same air, listening to every word. My heart was still beating, strong and steady, refusing to be ignored. And yet, in that moment, I felt invisible, like a piece of furniture in my own home, something useful but unnoticed. But feeling hurt more than any insult ever could. It cut deeper than anger, deeper than disappointment. That was the day I finally understood something painful, something no one ever warns you about. Sometimes, the people who are born from you, the ones you love the most, forget that you are still a person. They see you as a role, a responsibility, an ending. They forget that you still feel joy, still feel pain, still have a voice. Sit there, surrounded by raised voices and unspoken truths. I understood that my silence was not weakness. It was the calm before honesty. It was the moment before everything changed. Once upon a time, we were not like this. I say those words slowly now, because they feel almost like they belong to another lifetime, to another woman who looks like me but lived in a softer world. There was a time when our home was full, not just with people, but with noise and warmth and the kind of mess that only love can make. Back then, I never imagined a day when silence would sit so heavily in my living room, or when my children's voices would sound sharp instead of sweet. I remember when my children were small, when the days felt long but the years passed quickly. Their hands were always sticky with candy or jam, and no matter how often I washed them, they somehow stayed that way. Their shoes were forever lost, hidden under beds, behind doors, or left in places I could never understand. I spent so much time searching for those shoes, calling their names through the house, pretending to be annoyed while secretly smiling because those small problems meant they were still little, still mine. Their laughter filled every corner of our home, bouncing off the walls, spilling out into the street. Even now, if I close my eyes, I can almost hear it again. The sound of children laughing without worry, without fear, without knowing how complicated life could become. Their father and I did not have much money. There were times when we had to count every coin before going to the market, Times when I worried about how to stretch a meal so everyone could eat, but what we lacked in money, we made up for in other ways. We had warmth in our home, the kind that came from shared meals and shared stories. We had routine, simple and steady, the same bedtime rituals, the same morning rushes, the same small comforts that made life feel safe, and most of all, we had love, quiet and constant. Like a light that never went out even when the world outside felt dark. I cooked every meal, not because I had to, but because it was how I showed love. I learned their favorite dishes, remembered who liked more spice and who preferred things plain. I washed every shirt, every sock, every school uniform, scrubbing away stains that came from play and learning and growing. I stayed awake through fevers, sitting by their beds with a cool cloth and whispered prayers, listening to their breathing until it became calm again. I stayed awake through nightmares, holding them close until the fear passed, promising them that nothing bad would happen while I was there. I stayed awake through school worries too, helping with homework I barely understood, encouraging them before exams, telling them they were capable even when they doubted themselves. I never counted what I gave them. I never kept track of my sacrifices or measured my love. I did not think in terms of what I was losing. I only knew that being their mother was my life's purpose. It was who I was when I woke up in the morning and who I was when I went to sleep at night. Even when I was tired, even when my body ached, I felt full because my children were growing, learning, becoming themselves. Their father worked long hours. He left early in the morning and often came home when the sun was already low in the sky. He was a quiet man, not one for many words, but his presence filled the room in a gentle way. He was strong, steady, and kind, the kind of man who showed love through actions more than speech. When he came home tired, his shoulders slumped and his face lined with exhaustion, the children would run to him like he was the sun itself. They clung to his legs, climbed into his arms, and in those moments, all his tiredness seemed to melt away. I used to watch them from the kitchen, my heart full, knowing that this was what we had built together. We tried to teach them values, not through lectures, but through the way we lived. We tried to teach respect by listening to them and to each other. We tried to teach patience by waiting, by working slowly toward our goals, by showing them that not everything comes at once. We tried to teach gratitude by appreciating what we had instead of focusing on what we lacked, or at least, we tried. Looking back now, I wonder how much of it stayed with them, and how much was lost as life pulled them in different directions. As the years passed, life changed, the way it always does. The children grew up, their voices deepening, their opinions forming, their worlds expanding beyond our small home. They married, one by one, starting families of their own, building lives that no longer revolved around us. And they moved away, some farther than others, but all far enough that the house began to feel different. The rooms that were once full of noise and movement grew quieter. Toys disappeared. School bags were no longer thrown into corners. The house echoed in a way it never had before. At first I told myself this was normal. This was the natural order of things. Children grow, parents step back. I told myself to be proud, and I was. But pride does not stop loneliness from creeping in, especially in the evenings, when the sun sets and there is no one to ask how your day was. I still cooked, but the meals were smaller. I still cleaned, but there was less to clean. And I still waited for their father to come home, even when I knew he was already there, sitting quietly in his chair, reading the newspaper, smiling at me over his glasses. And then one day, my husband did not come home at all. There was no warning, no chance to prepare myself for what was coming. One moment, he was part of my life, as he had been for decades. The next moment, he was gone. His death changed everything, not just the way the house felt, but the way the world felt. Colors seemed duller, sounds felt distant. Even time itself seemed to slow down, dragging each second behind it. I became a widow overnight. A word I never thought would belong to me suddenly defined my existence. The bed felt too big, too empty, as if half of it had vanished. I found myself reaching out in the dark, only to touch cold sheets instead of his familiar warmth. The silence felt too loud, pressing in on me from all sides. I learned how heavy grief could be when you carry it alone, how it settles into your bones and makes even simple tasks feel exhausting. At first, my children were kind. They called often, sometimes every day, asking how I was, reminding me to eat, telling me to rest. They visited when they could, filling the house with voices again, even if only for a short while. They checked on me, made sure I was managing, offered help with things their father used to do. In those early days, I felt supported, surrounded by concern, and I told myself that even though I had lost my husband, I was not alone. But slowly, something shifted. It was subtle at first, easy to miss if you were not paying attention. The visits became shorter, the calls became rare, conversations that once focused on my well-being began to change direction. They asked how I was, but their voices sounded distracted, like they were already thinking about something else. The kindness was still there, but it became mixed with questions that made me uneasy even though I could not fully explain why. They asked about money, casually at first, as if it were just part of planning for the future. They asked about property, about the house, about what I intended to do with it. They asked about what would happen one day, using that phrase as if it were far away, as if it did not involve me at all. Each question landed softly, but together they formed a weight that pressed against my heart. I did not notice at first. Or maybe I noticed, but I chose to ignore it, because ignoring it was easier than facing what it might mean. I told myself they were just being practical. I told myself they were worried. I told myself that this was normal, that adults talk about these things. I wanted to believe that their questions came from care, not calculation. Because no mother wants to believe that her children see her as an ending instead of a beginning. No mother wants to think that the people she gave everything to might already be imagining a world without her in it. So I smiled. I answered their questions lightly. I changed the subject when it became uncomfortable. I held on to memories of sticky hands, lost shoes, and laughter-filled brooms, hoping that those memories still lived somewhere inside them too. But deep down, beneath the hope and the excuses, a quiet understanding was beginning to form. The family we once were had changed, not all at once, but piece by piece, until I barely recognized it. And even though I was not ready to admit it yet, even though it hurt too much to say out loud, I could feel that something important was slipping away, something fragile and precious, something I had spent my whole life trying to protect. The change did not happen all at once. It did not arrive with a warning or an announcement. It came quietly, like a thin crack in a wall that no one notices at first, the kind you tell yourself is harmless. But over time, that crack grows wider, deeper, until one day you realize the wall is no longer strong enough to hold what it once did. That is how it felt with my children. Nothing suddenly broke between us. It slowly wore down, piece by piece, word by word, silence by silence. My eldest son was the first to change, though I did not understand it then. He began offering advice I never asked for, speaking with a confidence that left no room for my own thoughts. He told me what I should do with my house, as if it were already a burden, instead of a home filled with my memories. He suggested renovations, sales, even hinted that I should move somewhere smaller, somewhere more suitable for someone my age. He spoke like he knew what was best, like my years of living, loving, and surviving no longer counted. I nodded politely, smiling the way mothers do when they do not want to cause trouble, even as a quiet ache settled in my chest. Then my daughter began changing too. She started asking about my jewelry, touching the pieces gently when she visited, her fingers lingering a little too long. She would hold something up to the light and say, almost casually, "You won't need this forever," and then laugh, like it was a joke. Her laughter made it sound harmless, but something about her eyes told a different story. Those pieces were not just decorations to me. They were moments of my life, small reminders of love, effort, and time. Hearing her speak about them like future possessions made me feel as if my memories were already being divided up. My youngest son worried about my pension. He asked detailed questions, spoke about payments and plans, and discussed it like it was already his responsibility. He used words like managing and handling, as if I were no longer capable of understanding my own affairs. I listened, answering softly, wondering when concern had turned into control. He never asked if I felt secure. He never asked if I was afraid. He only asked numbers and timelines, as if my life were a schedule waiting to be followed. What hurt the most was not what they asked, but what they did not ask. None of them asked how I felt. None of them asked if the nights felt too long or if the mornings felt too quiet. None of them asked if I was lonely sitting in that house without their father's voice filling the rooms. None of them asked if I missed him every single day in ways that words could never fully explain. They did not ask about my dreams, my fears, or my small hopes for the future. They spoke about my life like it was a checklist waiting to be completed, each item to be checked off when the time came. I began to feel like a guest in my own story, like someone watching from the outside while decisions were being made around me. Conversations felt different. There was less warmth, more calculation, less listening, more planning. I caught myself choosing my words carefully, afraid that saying the wrong thing would start another discussion about what I should do or what would happen eventually. I missed the days when my children came to me for comfort, not strategy. And then came the day they all gathered in my living room. I remember it clearly because something in the air felt heavy even before anyone spoke. The house was clean, as it always was when they visited, but it did not feel welcoming. It felt tense, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. They sat around the room, some on the couch, some in chairs, their bodies angled toward each other instead of toward me. I poured tea, my hands steady out of habit, even though my heart was already uneasy. It started as a simple conversation, or so I thought. They spoke about ordinary things at first, about work, about their children, about life moving forward. I listened, smiling when expected, nodding when appropriate. Then slowly, the topic shifted. One comment led to another, and before I could understand how it happened, the conversation turned into something else entirely. Voices grew louder. Words came faster. The calm surface broke, revealing everything that had been hidden underneath. Old resentments came out, things I did not even know they were still carrying. Jealousies surfaced, comparisons made openly, without shame. They argued about who deserved more, who had done more, who had sacrificed the most. Each one spoke like they were trying to prove something, not to me, but to each other. They brought up old favors, old mistakes, old hurts, using them like weapons. And there I was, sitting in the middle of it all, shrinking in my chair with every raised voice. I felt smaller than I ever had before. Not because they were angry, but because they seemed to forget why they were there in the first place. I was no longer their mother in that moment. I was the reason for the argument, the prize at the center of it, the silent figure everyone spoke over. I wanted to interrupt them. I wanted to remind them of bedtime stories I told when they could not sleep, of scraped knees I kissed better, of birthdays I made special with nothing but effort and love because we could not afford much else. I wanted to remind them of the years when I put myself last without ever thinking twice, but instead, I stayed silent. My voice felt stuck, somewhere deep inside me, buried under years of patience and understanding. I watched their faces, flushed with emotion, and realized that no reminder would change what was happening. They were not listening anymore. They were too busy trying to win, too busy protecting their own interests. And in that moment, something inside me finally broke. It was not a loud break. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden anger. It was quiet, like the last thread of a rope snapping under too much weight. I felt it in my chest, a soft but final release. I understood then that the love I had given so freely had slowly turned into expectation, that my silence had been mistaken for agreement, that my patience had been seen as permission. When they finally left, the house felt emptier than ever. The door closed behind them, and the sound echoed through the rooms. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence settle back into its place. Then I went to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, the same bed where I had cried after my husband died, the same bed that still felt too big. That night, I cried alone. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears that slipped down my face and soaked into my pillow, carrying with them years of unspoken hurt. Those tears were not just sadness, they were clarity. As I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I thought about my life, about everything I had given, about everything I still was. I realized that if I did nothing, nothing would change. I realized that my children needed to see me not as an ending, but as a person who still had a voice. And that was the night I decided to change my will. Changing my will was not an act of revenge. I want to say that clearly. Even now, because for a long time I questioned my own heart, wondering if pain had guided my hand. But the truth is simpler and quieter than that. It was not anger that led me to that decision. It was honesty. It was the first time in many years that I allowed myself to look at my life without excuses, without softening the edges to protect other people's feelings. It was an act of truth, and truth, I learned, can be both gentle and firm at the same time. After that night when I cried myself to sleep, I spent many days alone with my thoughts. I moved through my house slowly, touching familiar things, sitting in familiar places, listening to the clock tick in rooms that once echoed with noise. I thought about my children, about who they were when they were young and who they had become. I thought about myself, about how much I had changed too, about how often I had stayed quiet to keep peace, about how often I had told myself that this was just how life worked. And then, one afternoon, sitting by the window with the light warming my hands, I asked myself a simple question, one that felt almost dangerous to ask because of how honest it required me to be. Who was truly there for me? I did not rush to answer it. I let the question sit with me, following me from room to room, from morning into night. I wanted to be fair. I wanted to be kind. I wanted to give my children the benefit of every doubt. But the more I thought about it, the clearer the answer became, and that clarity hurt more than confusion ever could. The answer was not easy, and it was not my children. The person who was truly there for me was someone who checked on me without expecting anything in return. Someone who called just to ask how my day had been, not to ask about plans or possessions or one day. Someone who noticed when I was tired, when my hand shook slightly as I carried groceries, when my voice sounded different because I had not spoken to anyone all day. This person helped me without asking for reward, without keeping score, without reminding me later of what they had done. They treated me like I still mattered, like my presence in the world was valuable, not like I was a responsibility waiting to be passed on. It surprised me how clear that realization became once I allowed myself to see it. I felt a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that I was not imagining things. Sadness that it had taken so long for me to admit them. I thought about all the small moments that added up to something real, the quiet kindness that did not announce itself. And I understood then that love does not always come from where we expect it to come from. Sometimes it comes from where we least imagine, steady and sincere, without demand. When I finally went to see the lawyer, my hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the decision. His office was quiet, filled with the smell of old paper and polished wood. I sat across from him, feeling my age more than usual, aware that this was a moment that mattered. When I explained my decision, when I told him how I wanted to change my will, I saw surprise flicker across his face. He looked at me carefully, as if trying to understand the story behind my words, but he did not judge me. He did not question my motives or suggest I reconsider for the sake of appearances. He simply nodded, slowly and thoughtfully, and said, "It's your life." Those 3 words settled into me like a gift. It's your life. Not a burden, not an obligation, not a future inheritance waiting to be divided. My life, for the first time in a long time, I felt powerful, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a quiet, steady way that came from standing in my own truth. As I signed the papers, I felt something close to peace, like I had finally honored myself after years of putting everyone else first. Months passed after that. Life continued in its slow, ordinary way. My children visited from time to time, colds when it suited them. Nothing seemed different on the surface, but inside me, everything had shifted. I carried my decision with me like a secret I did not feel ashamed of, a boundary I had finally drawn. And then, one day, the argument happened again. This time, it was louder. This time, it was crueler. There was less pretending, less politeness, more sharp edges in their voices. They gathered once more, and the air felt heavy again, familiar and tense. Accusations came faster. Words were harsher. They spoke with frustration that bordered on anger, as if something they believed belonged to them was being delayed unfairly. And as I listened, I realized that this moment, this painful and moment, was no longer something I feared. It was something I was ready for. That was when I told them I did not shout. I did not cry. I spoke calmly, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. I told them that the will had been changed. I told them that they were not the main heirs. The words hung in the air, heavy and final, like a door closing softly but firmly. The room went silent, their faces froze, each one caught in a different expression of shock. For a moment, no one spoke. It was as if the world had paused, as if they needed time to understand what they had just heard. Then confusion crept in, their brows furrowing, their mouths opening slightly as they searched for the right response. Confusion quickly turned into anger. Voices rose. Questions were thrown at me, sharp and demanding. Anger turned into disbelief, as if what I had said could not possibly be true. They demanded answers. They demanded explanations. They wanted reasons that made sense to them, reasons that fit into the story they had already written in their minds. And for the first time in a very long time, I did not shrink back. I did not soften my words to protect them. I finally spoke, not as someone defending herself, but as someone telling the truth. I told them how their love had slowly turned into entitlement, how concern had quietly become calculation. I told them how every question about money and property made me feel smaller, how every suggestion about my life felt like a decision already made without me. I told them how it felt to sit in my own home and feel invisible, how it felt to be treated like a burden instead of a mother. I spoke about loneliness, about grief, about the silence they never asked me about. My voice did not shake, but my heart was open in a way it had not been before. They did not expect that truth. They did not expect to hear how deeply their words and actions had affected me. Some of them looked away. Some of them stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. And just when they thought they had heard everything, just when they believed the shock could not go any deeper, I said the name of the person they never expected, the person who had been there when they were not. In that moment, everything changed. I did not enjoy their shock. I did not enjoy the way their faces changed when the truth finally reached them. The way their mouths opened slightly as if they wanted to argue but could not yet find the words. I did not enjoy their pain, because no mother ever takes comfort in seeing her children hurt, no matter the reason. Even after everything that had happened, even after all the quiet wounds, my heart still reacted the way it always had. I wanted to reach out, to soften the moment, to tell them everything would be all right. But something stronger held me back, something calm and steady that told me this pain was not something I could protect them from. Not this time. What I felt instead was something I had not felt in years. Relief. It came slowly, like a deep breath after holding air in your lungs for too long. It was not loud or dramatic. It did not rush through me all at once. It settled gently in my chest, easing a weight I had carried without realizing how heavy it had become. For the first time in a very long time, I understood what it meant to choose myself, not in a selfish way, not in anger, but in truth. I had finally listened to the quiet voice inside me that had been asking for dignity, for recognition, for space to exist as more than an expectation. The days that followed were not easy. Silence arrived in different forms, some sharp, some heavy. Some of my children stopped calling after that day, as if cutting off their voices could erase what they had heard. Some accused me of betrayal, their words filled with disappointment and disbelief, as though I had broken an unspoken promise. Some said I was being cruel, that I was punishing them, that I was acting out of bitterness. Each accusation stung, not because it made me doubt myself, but because it reminded me how far apart we had grown. Still, deep inside, beneath the sadness and the worry that only a mother knows, I felt a steady certainty. I knew I had done the right thing. I did not stop loving them. A mother never does. Love like that does not disappear just because it has been wounded. It stays quiet and stubborn, even when it hurts. I still worried about them. I still hoped they were safe, that their children were healthy, that their lives were filled with moments of joy. But something important had changed. I stopped allowing my love to be mistaken for weakness. I stopped believing that staying silent was the same as being kind. I learned that boundaries do not erase love. They protect it. Now my days are quieter, but the quiet feels different. It is no longer heavy with expectation or fear. It is calm, like a soft morning before the world wakes up. I wake up without tension in my chest. I move through my home at my own pace, doing things because I want to, not because I feel watched or judged. I still miss my husband deeply. Some nights, his absence feels as sharp as it did in the beginning. I still think of my children when I cook their favorite meals, catching myself making too much food before remembering that it is just me now. Those habits are hard to let go of, and I do not try to force myself to forget them. What has changed is the way I rest. I sleep better knowing my life is no longer something to be divided, no longer a conversation held over my head. I sleep knowing that my worth is not measured by what I leave behind, but by who I am while I am still here. I feel lighter, not because everything is perfect, but because I am no longer carrying the weight of unspoken truths. I am still here, still breathing, still waking up each morning with thoughts and feelings and choices of my own. I am still deserving of respect, not because of what I own, but because I am a person who has lived, loved, and endured. I no longer feel invisible in my own story. I have reclaimed my place in it, quietly and without apology. And if there is one lesson I want to leave behind, one truth I hope lingers long after the arguments have faded, it is this: do not wait until someone is gone to value them. Do not speak about people as if they are already memories while they are still sitting in front of you, listening. Because sometimes, when you finally look up, when you finally realize what you have taken for granted, they have already changed everything.